suppose it's been a couple of years since I took the Brooklyn Poets Sonnet course where I met you, but I feel like
Yes.
because of Twitter and I read your newsletters, I feel like it really hasn't been that long. It's been a long time since we've spoken, but it doesn't feel like that long. Like you're in my brain orbit pretty regularly.
Yes, thanks to the dubious pleasures of social media, it is possible now to keep track of one another without having to directly interact, which for some people, especially those who suffer from social anxiety, is a boon, and for other people, it's a bit of a dystopian uh, nightmare. But I'm happy to oscillate back and forth between those two poles.
You know what? I do too. It really depends on my mood. I was thinking about that today. Some days I'm like, gosh, I just really love the internet. And then some days I can't stand myself and I can't stand the internet and I can't stand social media. And then it goes
I
away.
know.
And then I'm like, oh, no, I love it.
It's interesting. I had there's a thought experiment that I've had recently, and I thought, well, just imagine if when the internet broke wide, which would have been 1995, imagine if some benevolent alien overlord had appeared and said, okay, you can have the World Wide Web, but you can't monetize it. No commerce of any kind whatsoever can occur on it. It is a public utility. And then just sort of imagine what that would look like. And probably it would just look like Wikipedia at that point, the great irony now is that as everything is collapsing in a horrible tide of AI nonsense, Wikipedia is now one of the most trustworthy places on the web. Isn't that funny when you think back
Yeah.
20 years ago, and 30 years ago? Anyway. That's a lovely thought experiment I have where it's just like, oh, right, the internet. Nobody can make any money off of it, so it's going to be fine.
I can't actually, I'll have to sit down and really think about that because I can't even imagine the internet is money. That's where the money goes. Although I will say I work in marketing, so I'm a big proponent and I'm definitely feeding the internet money monster and benefiting from it. But one thing I like to do when I work with brands is like we have our own thought experiment where we try to remember how people gained audiences and gained customers before the internet happened, because I do see this
Yes.
problem where people are like, we got to get a Facebook meta ads budget, and that's like we got to put all of this money into SEO and all of these, and we need videos, and they can't see outside of that. And I'm like, listen, people bought things before we were online, and sometimes those are
Yeah.
the most lucrative tactics that people can do now. It's just to go back. It's like, get your direct mailers out, go in person to a farmer's market.
Yes.
You might have a much better experience financially, and your soul might be fed a little bit.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about that is that it used to be, before the internet, it was the most effective marketing of any kind was word of mouth. So once you made the initial splash, that somehow got people interested in talking about something. And so you could say that, word of mouth, social media is just a new version of word of mouth, but it feels different because it's not sort of organic word of mouth. It's a word of mouth that is somehow structured by algorithms. You know what I mean? So there is that sense of you're having to suddenly interact with a machine, as opposed to just, oh wow, everybody's talking about this, this thing. So
I think you're exactly right. I also think that word of mouth, maybe 10 years ago, maybe 15 on the internet, like that felt more genuine. And now it's like, well, I mean, like part of my job, this is awful, but part of my job is creating like fake word of mouth. Like that's the game now, is how do you,
yeah.
oh, well, I'll have to reflect on my life choices a little bit later.
Sorry, I didn't. Yes, I didn't mean to. It's not
you. This is a constant conversation I am having with
Yeah.
myself. My life is divided
Yeah.
between like art and poetry, and then
it's okay to remember that the internet was doomed the moment YouTube launched in 2005, because at that point the old sort of initial dream of the internet went away, and the internet just became television with an optional library attachment. So really, it's it's just how things shifted out.
Well, they will shift again.
Yeah.
We'll see what
Well,
the
yeah,
future holds.
after the apocalypse and the civilization collapses, it's going to be a lovely big shift out of that. So there we go. We have that to look forward to.
Exactly. Okay.
Hmm.
All right. I want to ask for, can
Yes.
you give a brief introduction? Would you be willing to do that?
Yeah. My name is Gregory Crosby. I am a poet. I am the author of two books of poetry, Walking Away from Explosions and Slow Motion, which came out in 2018 from the Operating System, and Said No One Ever, which was published in 2021 by Brooklyn Arts Press. Years ago, I used to be a journalist and a critic, uh, and I gave it all up for poetry, so to speak. And for the last 20 years, I've been an adjunct professor teaching literature, creative writing, and composition at various institutions in New York City.
And you also teach outside of academia.
Yes,
Do you make a
I.
distinct do you make a distinction in your mind about that, or does it feel like all the same thing?
Well, you know what's interesting about teaching both online and in person for Brooklyn Poets, which is a marvelous nonprofit organization that offers all kinds of poetry events, readings, and workshops here in Brooklyn, is that one of the things I don't get to do in terms of academia is I never get to work with graduate students. You know what I mean? I never get to work with MFA people. I'm always working with an undergraduate population. And Brooklyn Poets Workshops, which are extremely diverse, it's a very diverse and inclusive organization, which is wonderful, not just in terms of gender and ethnicity, but also in terms of age. One of the great things is that I often, sitting around a table leading a Brooklyn Poets Workshop, is I feel like, oh, this is what it would be like if I was teaching in an MFA program at the graduate level. So I really treasure all of the workshops I do for Brooklyn Poets because it has that vibe.
Yours was the first online workshop, like extended workshop. I think it was 6 weeks that it ever taken. I don't have an MFA. I am from small town Arkansas, and it was just like this really wonderful opportunity to get to examine poetry, learn about poetry, write poetry, and this sort of, I guess it felt like an advanced level. It was just the first experience I ever had like that, and I loved it.
Mm-hmm. And one of the, uh, one of the few benefits of, the lost year of the lockdown and beyond was to do all of those online workshops. Ever since Brooklyn Poets opened their brick and mortar space in Brooklyn Heights, I've been doing in-person workshops. I have to admit that I think this is almost, I don't want to trivialize the phrase PTSD, but there came a certain moment where just being on Zoom for any reason really started to give me the hives. And so I've been mostly doing in-person workshops since they opened the brick and mortar. But I think I'm slowly coming out of that, and I hope to do some online workshops again in the future. Many people, including you, who do not live in New York City, have occasionally drop me a message saying, hey, when are you going to do an online workshop again? So I think I need to do another one sometime soon.
Can you talk about your early experiences writing, and was it always poetry, or, well, no, I guess not necessarily, because you were doing journalism and other types of things.
Oh, no, no. Yeah, I was always a writer, but, I became a poet in part by becoming a failed fiction writer. Um, like I wrote poetry and short stories and all kinds of things, like as a teenager in high school and just beyond. But for a long time, I was very fixated on writing or trying to write, fiction. And in my mid-20s, when I became a professional writer, well, two things happened. I'm from Las Vegas. I grew up there and I left Las Vegas briefly to live in San Francisco in the early 90s. And when I came back to Vegas and sort of picked up my life after a disastrous relationship that had brought me to the Bay Area, I became a professional writer and writing in cultural and arts journalism and becoming an editor and doing that for about a decade, both on staff and, full-time freelance. And at the same time, there was this really vibrant poetry scene in Vegas that was, very much coming out of performance poetry and sort of the slam era, but also just a lot of really talented, interesting people literary poets as well as performance poets, and it was kind of inspiring to suddenly discover that, which it hadn't really been around when I was growing up there in the 80s. I also discovered that if you make a living as a writer of prose, when the day is done, you're kind of exhausted, or at least I was, and it was very hard to then work on a short story or let alone a novel. But I found that I could write poems, that I could be just, driving around or and composing poems in my head. And I could sit down and write a short poem, and there it was. So about 10 years went by, and at one point I just had a lot of poems. I put out, two or three classic poetry chapbooks that, you made yourself at Kinko's. And, it's one of the great things about poetry is that it's very DIY in that way, and that you can just put out make your own chapbook and nobody looks askance at you if you put that in the world. And I had very little fiction. I had a lot of fragments and whatnot. And at some point, right around the same time, I realized that journalism was kind of collapsing as a profession, as as something that was viable, in the, back there around the turn of the century. I realized, maybe that poetry was the way to go. And also after, almost 10 years of writing a lot of poems, I felt like I was writing at a level that I could take it really seriously. So in my mid-30s, I decided to go to grad school to get an MFA, and figure out my next steps in life. So, and that was interesting too, to get an MFA at the age of 36, where everybody around me was either 26 or in their 50s. Coming back after a lifetime of not writing and doing stuff was sort of odd. But that's when it happened. And that's what I've been doing ever since. I keep threatening in my mind and to others to write essays again about various subjects, and occasionally I will write essays. But 99 times out of 100, when I sit down to write, it's a poem that comes out. And and it might be a poem that is, in fact, an essay of a kind or something like that. But yeah, poetry has become the main thing that I write, and that I embraced in my early 30s as being, this is actually what I'm supposed to be doing. This is it.
Was flash fiction I don't know how to ask this.
I
Was
know what
it
you're going to ask.
trendy?
Flash fiction was not a thing in the 90s.
Okay.
Back in my day, we called it a prose poem. That's what it was. It was a prose poem. It wasn't
I
this
mean, I
flash
asked.
fiction nonsense. But yeah, flash fiction was not. I mean, it probably was a thing, but it wasn't something that I was cognizant of or aware of in the way I was aware of more traditional kinds of things. And if it occurred to, and I did write a lot of prose poems as well over that time. I think I wrote a lot of proto flash fictions, but for me they were just prose poems. And as everyone knows, when I tell students, it's like, oh, why is this a prose poem? How is this? And students sort of like, and then finally somebody says, it's just a poem you wrote in prose. And it's like, yes, that's exactly right. That's all it is. This is all just prose poem. It's a prose poem if you say it is. It's a flash fiction if you say it is. It just
Right.
depends on what you call it. So yeah, I was not glued into that app channel, and I don't think it really was a channel in the 90s. I think again that was something that had to really come to fruition with the rise of the web.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, genre gets almost more important or easier because of keywords and search function, and that's informing how we're thinking about things and defining things.
It certainly wasn't something people were talking about in the 90s. Except, but again, I was in Las Vegas. Very, it's not like I was, in the center of some kind of, literary renaissance.
I lived in Las Vegas for a very short period of time of my life. It was very
Oh,
strange. I did.
that is strange.
It was strange. I had just had a baby and my mother had passed away, and I was in a rocky marriage, and we were like, well, we have to
Right.
do something to fix all of our problems. Let's move across the country. So
Yeah,
we
let's go
did
to
that.
Vegas. Everyone's
Yes.
problems are fixed by Las Vegas.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm like the most sort of square, flowers, trees, sober, modest, quiet. Like it's just ridiculous. It's so comical. And then we lived in Vegas for 6 months. It did not fix
Yeah.
all our problems, but it was an
No,
important
no.
step.
Did you at least get out into the desert?
I did spend some time in the desert, which was really nice.
Good.
And
Because
I was able,
that's the great thing about Vegas is that if at any moment the Vegasness of Vegas gets you, you literally just hop in your car and within an hour you are in the most beautiful spaces where there is nobody around.
yeah, I did really, really enjoy that. And it reminded me a lot of my childhood. So I think it was good actually to sort of go back and revisit that kind of climate and that ecosystem of growing up in,
Yeah.
the Coachella Valley. And so it was a good
Hmm.
trip, but it was, anyway, every time somebody talks about Vegas, I think I like flashback to those 6 months. And then I
Yeah.
had also visited, and the first time I ever walked down the Las Vegas Strip, I was like 7 months pregnant. And that was such a weird experience as well.
Good thing about Vegas is that in the 90s, a sort of a little arts district sort of appeared, which is still sort of there. It keeps vaguely shifting from street to street uh, over the years, but there's a lot of there's Vegas since the 90s has always had some kind of wonderful, small, hip downtown art scene. Um, and anytime anybody is going to Vegas and wants something that's outside of the usual suspects of experience, I always have a little list of things that they can experience and sort of connect up with in Vegas that they would never know about because again, most people it's like somebody who comes to New York and like they spent their whole time in Times Square and you'd be like,
Right.
you didn't really go to New York, So
Right. I
um,
was vaguely aware of the arts district, but I couldn't get myself there. Nobody else was interested around me, and
yeah,
but it
yeah,
was like there.
you're
It was like one day I will find my
yeah.
way, and maybe in the future I'll go back, and that will be the only thing that I visit, and then I can kind of heal my relationship with Vegas, and we can reconnect.
Yeah, no, if you ever go back, I will give you the tour. I will give you a list of things to do and see that will make you feel very okay about Vegas.
Okay, good, amazing. We will heal our relationship with Zoom and with Vegas, and then eventually all
Yes.
will be right. You mentioned
Yes.
the DIY aspect of poetry. Do you
Hmm.
does that feel like it still exists to you? Do you still feel that like printing off your own chapbooks, hand binding them, that does that still seem alive in your
I mean, it's
brain?
still alive. For me, less so, simply because I'm just sort of beyond all that. In much the same way, if you, I mean, I led in Vegas and in New York lots of reading series, right? Including reading series that had open mics. I can't speak for others, but at a certain point, I felt like I've done my dues. I don't ever need to run another open mic as long as I live. So it's not like I'm against open mics. And actually, Brooklyn Poets has a wonderful monthly open mic called the Brooklyn Yawp, which actually I'm going to be. They always have one of the mentors at Brooklyn Poets lead it. They do a little generative little session, and then there's an open mic. I'm actually going to do it for the first time in a while in July. That's a great open mic. But that said, I don't want to be responsible for an open mic anymore. So for me, after I sort of did three self-published chapbooks in the 90s before I moved to New York and embraced the MFA, that to me was plenty. It was like, okay, I've done the next time I put out a chapbook, it's going to be on a small press. And it was in 2014, the operating system, which later put out my first book, put out a chapbook of mine called Spooky Action at a Distance. That was, and again, it was a chapbook, but it was a nice looking, small press chapbook. So, I love the DIY aspect of poetry, but for myself, I'm sort of like, okay, I'm you know, my goal was always to have books in the world. I'm very much a book person, even more so than having poems appear in journals, right? I was always very much my fantasy was always to walk into a bookstore and see a stack of my books on the table since I was like 15, and it took an inordinately long time for that to happen, but it did finally happen. So
That when
yeah.
you're writing, are you thinking about the book, or do you write the poems and then you have a certain amount and you collect them into something?
Well, that's the thing is that I have several unpublished manuscripts that are vaguely chronological compared to the two books that have been published, which are also vaguely chronological. Said No One Ever is actually two manuscripts that I smashed together and took a bunch of stuff out. So that's how that book came into being finally. Because I write all the time. I'm probably too prolific in terms of that. Uh, but I don't care. I got over that at some point because at some point I realized this is what you're supposed to be doing. Just do it. It's up to anyone else there's some poets who just very rarely publish and very rarely send things out in the world. I know poets who will polish a handful of poems over, not just over months, but over years before they would even think of sending them out. And that's fine, but I can't, that to me would be paralyzing. I would much rather just write it, revise it, send it in the world, see if that's why I have the newsletter, why I send drafts of poems on the newsletter just to get some kind of, feedback. Sometimes those poems get revised, sometimes they don't. But if I just wrote something and just sat on it, uh, I, to me that doesn't work for me. I need some kind of like, well, here it is. What do you think? In the world. So yeah, I'm always thinking in terms of manuscripts, but honestly, manuscripts usually just come together after I've written a bunch of poems. Uh, the only long poetic sequence I've written was my MFA thesis, which I was never able, which was a finalist for a prize, but I otherwise have never been able to get published because of its subject matter and because it's also an homage to John Berryman's Dream Songs. But it was very important to me as something that made me think, oh, okay, I'm going to I'm going to see what an MFA is like, see if I'm going to test what I'm doing in the world in which I wish to enter. So, yeah, I'm often thinking of books, but it's very much organic, sort of like, well, here's what I've been writing of late. Does this work together when I finally sort of open up I have a document called Recent Poems where I just dump everything and then I just sort of sort through that and see where things might happen or where they're going. I do have a manuscript that is also a poetic sequence about Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, which I've been working on off and on for years, and every so often go back to. But in general, it's very much about individual poems and less about book projects. And the poet Dorothea Lasky one time had a whole sort of thing where she was saying like, why is everybody working on a project? Can we have like more poems and less projects? Can we just focus on actual individual poems? And I remember reading that and thinking like, yeah, I like that. Which is nothing, well, again, not to say projects are a bit terrible. Projects are great, but there did seem to be in recent years, there seemed to, every poet seemed to be doing some kind of project less than thinking about individual poems, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. And as somebody who, again, doesn't have an MFA, but I feel like I observe the products of MFAs. And in the beginning,
Hmm.
I didn't realize that that's what it was, that a lot of my favorite collections that I were reading, I was like, God, everybody knows some magic key or some like secret that I'm not understanding because the books felt, I mean, different and wonderful and I love them, but they had like a similar kind of sheen, a similar kind of polish. I found
Yeah.
myself,
Yeah.
and then I started to look into it. I'm like, some of them, it was like four people were in the same exact MFA cohort, and I was like, oh,
Yeah.
that explains a lot here. And then I think I was able to
And you
release
don't,
a
and
little bit.
you
Go
Yeah, you
ahead.
don't have to have an MFA to like fall into that. There's also all those trends and fashions and things that are just sort of floating around in the poetry world where will just hook into a thing and that will be the way a lot of people write for a while, whether they're an MFA person or not, until somebody goes, there's a little bit too much of this. Can we
Yes.
break this up? Can we do something different? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it did to inform how I was looking at my own writing and I have this, I want a full length very much, but I also don't want to, I don't want to rush something and then sort of regret it existing. Uh, but
Right.
I kind of go back and forth like, and I also want to be a person that has a very highbrow, lofty, philosophical project and to say that I have created
Hmm.
that. But then I also look in the mirror and I'm like, you just want to write about your neighbors. What are you doing? Like
And
just
those
embrace where you are.
those aren't mutually exclusive. Your highbrow philosophical project could be about your neighbors. You know what I mean?
It could be. I think probably the answer is you should just do the writing and not think about
Yes.
what the
Yes.
writing is going to look like. I was going to ask about your newsletter. I read today you sent out your poem, Monday Wears Tuesday's Face Like a Mask, which I love.
Yes. I
And
literally wrote that about 2 hours ago.
that's, you're sending out unpublished work and then seeing what happens with it?
So the newsletter only has 140 subscribers. Let's be real here for a moment. Of which maybe only a little over half even open the emails. There's a handful of people who will sometimes respond with, "Hey, I like this," or "This really struck me," or what have you. It varies. Uh, I say they're drafts, and sometimes they are, but 9 times out of 10, the poems that get sent out are finished poems. Uh, I have to admit to something that is very obnoxious and which I do not recommend to anyone, any poet who might be listening, especially a young poet listening to this podcast. I was the asshole who would always, when I did workshops myself as a workshop participant, not as a leader, I was the person who would always bring in a banger of a poem that's already done and hand it out and have everybody go, "This poem is amazing." Well, I'm saying it, and I just be like, and I would just, "Yeah, I know." To the point where the last time that we had, my wife and I, and who's also a poet, and a few friends had an informal writing group, I kept doing that. And my friends just looked at me and said, what's the point? Why are you bringing things that are fine into a workshop? The whole point of workshop is to sort of like go, "Oh, here's this thing. I don't know. Oh, hey, can I get some help?" And I would just be like, because I'm an asshole. And I just want, nothing but praise and love. I'm a former theater kid, so it's just sort of like, one of those things, where I do that. So I just send the poems out, and sometimes, and you may have had this experience too, sometimes when you write something, you just think, "Oh, no, that's fine, that'll do." And other times you write something, you're like, "Oh, yes, yes, that's what I was aiming for. I hit it. It's so great. Oh." And then you share it with the world, and everybody the poem that you think is so great that really hits what you were trying to do, everybody just sort of shrugs. And the poem that you wrote with like your left hand, like whatever, everybody's like, "Oh my God, I love this poem so much. It's so," and you're just like, "Really? What?" It's completely mysterious to me. The poem I sent out before this one was the elegy for Roger Corman, who passed away. And one of my best friends from high school said, "This is one of the most beautiful things you've ever written." And I'm like, "Really? That just feels like something I wrote just because I needed to somehow mark, the passing of this giant of cinema, history and whatnot." You can never ever know what the response is. And I think that's why I do send things out in the newsletter, and why I'm much less precious with poems than I was certainly in my 20s. Uh, I just need to like do it and put it in the world and see what happens.
My biggest, like, quote unquote fancy publication that I've ever had, I wrote, I mean, maybe 15 minutes, almost no
Mm-hmm.
editing. I wrote it and then
Mm-hmm.
I sort of emailed it out 2 days later. And then now I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, I can see things I would still sort of change about it, but I can't. And it's also the poem that I'll have, like, a stranger will email me and say, "I really love this poem you wrote," which is baffling to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
um and it's the
But
one I
also
think I've
good.
worked the least hard on, but
Yeah.
it's so strange, and it's so different from
Yeah,
everything
it
else in
is.
my life, where you're supposed to work really hard on something and then you get the whatever, the gold star, the payment, or the
No,
accolade. And so this is like,
no,
oh,
that that's not how it
no
works. By the way,
matter.
remember, you can always be like Auden and just, even after something's published, totally revise it and change it around. You can, I mean, I try, I don't. If something is actually published either in a journal or in a book, I leave it alone. But there's plenty of poets who don't do that, who will, revise things long after they've been published. So never feel bad. In other words, I think what I'm trying to say is never feel bad about revising something even after it's been published. But also, it's perfectly okay to be like, that was a moment. It's in the past. I'm going to let it be.
Yeah, I have been trying to cultivate that attitude. I appreciate that attitude, and also noticing that the published poems are like windows into my past self, and I can appreciate them. I can like them, even if I would do something different now. It's nice that there's a record and that they exist,
Yeah,
and I don't need to kind of cower from them.
yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any advice on running a successful workshop or workshopping other people's writing?
It's very, very simple. First of all, you're there to help. It is never a creative writing teacher's job to tell a student that they're a terrible writer, because the world will tell them that soon enough. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you're really just terrible and bad, the marketplace, so to speak, will tell you that. It's not my job to be a dream crusher. I don't want to be a dream crusher. I want to be the person who uh, the opposite. I want to run the dream, the film of the dream getting crushed. I want to put that into reverse and watch the crushed dream sort of blossom back up into its fullness. So that's a big thing. I always accentuate the positive, try to always be constructive, and I always just tell everybody you're all in this together. Be constructive with each other. Be kind. The golden rule for workshop for me is give people the kind of comments on their work and feedback that you would want to receive on. And to me, that's the way to go, to just sort of be like, hey. And also the thing, and as you may recall from the workshop that we did, I always tell everybody, it's like, I'm just another poet here. Yes, I'm in the position of leading the workshop, but anything I say to you that's helpful, great. Anything I say to you and you're like, you're full of shit, that's fine too. I'm just here to be helpful, and sometimes I may make a suggestion or an idea that is not helpful, and feel free to ignore it. So I guess what I'm saying is my philosophy is just get people to write, get people to read, and get people to just accentuate the positives, and figure out what it is that they're trying to do. And be helpful. Just be helpful. That's really all a workshop leader should be, is trying to be helpful. And like in a real way, not in a, Simpsons, I'm helping kind of way. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes who run workshops, their ego gets in the way of being helpful. So
I have workshopped friends' poems and noticed that own impulse in myself, or I sort of sometimes I'll forget that I'm speaking to a human a little bit. This is awful to admit.
Yeah.
But I'll forget, and I'll kind of think like, well, if this is my poem, I would,
right.
What would I do here? I always regret when I say these things out loud, because it's not my poem. It's a fun thought experiment.
I will sometimes do that, but I will always preface it with, I'm going to say something really obnoxious now. So feel free to ignore it. But if this were my poem, and I make it clear that this is an obnoxious thing to say, but I try to only do that when I have what I feel like is a really good idea for the poem that they can either accept or reject. But I do couch it in that way of like, please feel free to ignore this, but I'm just going to like throw this idea out anyway.
Do you send your writing off to friends?
No, did you not hear me earlier about how I was the asshole who just brought in everything that was already behind workshops? No, I don't. Well, no. I mean, the newsletter is a form of workshop, but it's not really workshop so much as feedback. It's more like, here's the handful of people who, for whatever reason, open up every newsletter and read what I've sent them, and sort of measuring what people have to say about that is usually the feedback that I get. And I do have a couple. The publisher of Brooklyn Arts Press, who's a brilliant writer by the name of Joe Pan. There are certain people who, if they respond to a newsletter poem, you think, okay, that's doing well. So whenever Joe sort of, because he edited and published my second book, whenever Joe responds to a thing, I'm thinking, and I think that's really what you have to find in life is you have to just find. It's not that you have to do a lot of workshops, but you have to find a handful of people whose opinions you really respect and really value, and share your work with them. I think that is often the best way to sort of, outside of a formal workshop structure, is the best way to sort of figure out if something you've written has legs or not.
You seem to me to be somebody that is so certain of your tastes and your interests and your choices in your writing.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Sure. At some point in my 20s and 30s, I was so sort of wrapped up with this notion of writing an identity. Like, I am a writer, right? I'll never forget one of my undergrad professors saying, you can call yourself a writer all you want, but sooner or later other people have to agree with you. And I was always so bound up in terms of that with identity that I was much more ambitious for myself and being seen, you know what I mean? Than I was for the work itself. And really it was only in my late 30s that I realized, I need to be ambitious for the work and not for myself. So that certainty, I think, is just a matter of, I'm older, and it's been a long time since I've been doing this. I know I can do it at a certain level, but that's nothing compared to, well, have you done anything really, really good? And the only way the reality is you never know. only time will tell that, and probably after you're dead, maybe. So um, that's the other reason why I just sort of write and put things in the world, because I won't be, if anything I've written has any kind of long-term value, I won't be around to see it. So I might as well just do it and not worry about
Well, I'm mostly interested in people who are able to write and publish and not feel afraid of that or overly nervous about that or constantly editing their work until it's like,
it. Yeah.
it's become dust. And I notice in the last couple of years, I will write something and I will fear that I'm being sort of delusionally happy with a thing that I've written, or I'll get feedback and I'll go like, "That's helpful," but I'm not going to change it. I won't say this out loud, but in my brain, I'm like, "I'm not going to change it."
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then I go, "Is this like, are you becoming like hardened to the world? Is this a problem?" And I'm starting to notice that, in fact, some of the most, I would say, like the least neurotic writers I meet seem to be somewhat similar in the sense that they're like, well, I like it. So I get to write it and make it and publish it. And then that's it. And then
Yeah.
they kind of walk away. And so I'm now
Yeah.
going, look, maybe you could just embrace that feeling. Maybe that's a natural progression.
Do that in my 20s. In my 20s, I was too, and it paralyzed me. I didn't write anything for about 5 years in my 20s because I was so hung up on all of those things you're just talking about. And I really, the other great thing about becoming a poet as opposed to a fiction writer is nobody cares. It's poetry. No
Yes.
one cares. It's impossible to sell out. It's impossible to sell your poem to HBO, and turn it into a series. Uh, and once I embraced poetry, I realized, oh, I'm free to do whatever I want because nobody really cares, except for the handful of people who, for it's like it feeds their soul. And that's what I'd rather do anyway, is feed people's souls rather than, you know, uh, have something I've written turned into an HBO series, right? Which, and again, there's nothing wrong with having your, work turned into an HBO series. That's great. But the pressure was off once I sort of embraced poetry, in that sense. It just was like, no one cares. Just do it. Just write, just write whatever you want to write and try to put it in the world and see if something happens. Um, but again, there's also that sense of like, depending on what kind of stuff you're writing, it's the classic thing. I feel like writers are people who want to be seen and unseen at the same time. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's pathological how much I kind of wish to be shy and mysterious. And I am very afraid of other people's, of people perceiving me or having a perspective on me. And yet, something personal or embarrassing or ugly about myself, gonna stick it in a poem, publish the poem,
Yeah.
share it a lot on social media, hope people tell
Yeah.
me like, I like your sentences about that horrific event.
Yeah. I mean, if you're someone who is truly like, oof, that's how pen names come into being, right? You can truly just create a persona if you're truly someone who wants to not be seen, but at the same time put yourself into the world. But again, there's something. I think there's something valuable in just being like, I me. The poem is the poem. There's an intersection, but it's like the classic, never confuse the speaker of the poem with the writer of the poem, with that idea. I think once somebody understands that, a lot of that stuff sort of evaporates. The problem is, of course, there's plenty of people who they never sort of, you know, understand that distinction. And you're probably not writing for those people anyway.
Now, one thing that I have done that has helped, because I will have family or people, neighbors, and sort of non poetry people read some of my work, and sometimes I write things specifically for them. I feel like my first chapbook was almost
Hmm.
like, read this, but then don't read anything else I ever write. And so now my work is really shifting because I'm like, well, they have their thing, and then I can now write a little bit more honestly. But one thing
Yeah.
I noticed that sort of very classic idea of I'm not the narrator wasn't working, and they just were like, "You're so full of shit," which may be
Yeah.
fair. But one thing I did do that I think has helped is I'll explain. This was true in the moment that I wrote the poem, but it's not
Right.
the overall philosophy of my life. It's not always true.
Right.
This is just a little snapshot of a feeling that I had that made it into this one, specific piece of
Yeah.
writing.
And yeah, whenever I teach I teach creative writing to college now students, which are high school students who are taking college classes after their full day of high school for early credit. And I always kick things off with Philip Larkin's "This Be the Verse," you know, and you know, which is basically saying like, yeah, the only way out of the misery of parents screwing up every generation, screwing up the next, is to not have any kids, right? And I ask my students, I say, do you think that he was really serious that everybody should like, never have kids? It's the only way out of this situation. Is that a very healthy thing for the survival of the species? And the students were like, yeah, no. And I said, but do you get what it might be like to feel this way sometimes? And they're like, oh yeah. I said, well, that's, in other words, this isn't a philosophy necessarily that's being put forth. It could just be like one of those moments where you think, ugh, there's no way out of this trap except to do this, extreme thing. And poetry can be a place where you can do that. In fact, all of literature is you can do that.
I do think poetry allows for that much more than other mediums, at least currently, the way
Yeah,
people sort of interpret writing. I don't necessarily think that like novelists are the novelists are changing, but I think the way novelists are being perceived is changing. So that while their novel, maybe they wrote it and it was supposed to be of a moment, it's certainly perceived as this is their this is who they are, this is their manifesto on the page kind of thing. Essays for
yeah,
sure. It's really interesting to read older essays, which are much more exploratory and curious and open, and really felt like
yeah,
points of discussion. And today it doesn't feel that way a lot of the times, or they're not
yeah.
received
Well,
that way.
yeah. Well, we're in a moment where everyone has forgotten the lessons of Oscar Wilde, and people now have once again, and it's cyclical across history, where literature and morality are welded together in a way that does a disservice to both. And we're in one of those moments culturally in a lot of ways. And the wheel will turn, and we'll sort of go back to yeah, no, uh, that's not really how literature or art works. But it always, you know, you know, anytime someone's like, oh yeah, I only want likable characters. There was just a there was just a piece in the New York Times. Reese Witherspoon has started a book club, and like in the opening paragraph, she's like, books have to be, the books in my club, they have to be optimistic. Otherwise, I'm not going to include them in my book club. And on the one hand, you're like, well, yeah, it's your book club, do whatever you like. But on the other hand, I'm thinking like, wow, you just cut out so much by sort of having these artificial, like a book has to be this or that. A book just has to be a book, and it gives you something or it doesn't.
Isn't it
Yeah,
nice to know what the horrible people in the world are thinking? Isn't it an important experiment to see the horribleness in yourself and to really explore that versus pretending
yes,
as if we don't have
yes,
access? That's the most dangerous
yes.
thing, is to just sort of assume that evil people are over there and I could never, I can't even imagine what it's like. I can't even read a book that
Yeah.
imagines what it's like to be unlikable, to say the least, or truly evil.
Oh, just the writer Glenn Duncan has a great line where he says, "Literature is humanity without the judgment." In other words, here's the realm of human experience, but you don't have to sit in judgment because these aren't real people; they're patterns of words on a page.
Well, I love that ideal. I wish more people felt the same way. But as you
Yeah,
said, it is cyclical. Things will change. And poetry to me
yeah.
definitely feels like a little comet, where we get these great
Hmm.
persona poems and we get these just more nuance, which I'm very excited about. Can I ask you two more questions?
Yeah, of course.
What are you thinking a lot about these days? Is there anything in particular on your mind?
Uh, you mean uh, you mean besides the state of the world?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, what are you obsessing about? Is it the state of the?
I,
I
you know,
mean,
I'm thinking. I'm thinking a lot. I'm thinking a lot lately about how I need to sort of change my relation to a lot of social media because it is uh, dissatisfying. I will say Blue Sky is a nice sort of has become a good sort of refuge from the zombie that is now Twitter. But I think I need to sort of I've been thinking about somehow figuring out doing posting different kinds of things or treating it somewhat differently. Because the thought of just, well, I'm just going to like log off. I mean, I keep making the joke in various platforms, like, hey, everybody, it's another great day to log off forever. And as wonderful as that sounds, I know I'm not going to log off forever. Um, So I've been thinking about somehow changing. I'm also, now that the semester is wrapped up for me, I turn in final grades tomorrow. I'm also thinking of what I think about every summer, which is, okay, well, what are you gonna write this summer? That's just not more poems. And I have been thinking about, dare I say, a couple of essay projects, where I'm going to write some short essays about, thinking about writing some short essays about objects and books from my childhood that have resonated across the decades for me, for whatever reason, and sort of exploring that. So who knows? When September rolls around, maybe I'll have written that. Maybe it will just go. It'll just be, a Word doc. But I have been thinking about, and again, I think this every summer is like, how can I shake things up with my writing? What can I do that might be different? Because I do have more time once the summer rolls around. So that's what I've been thinking about when I'm not thinking about then I'm thinking about this ridiculous veil of tears that we've all entered in. The other day I was thinking, like, I'm so glad I'm the age I am, so I could, remain firmly rooted in the late 20th century, because boy, the 21st century did not. I was promised jetpacks and flying cars and Mars colonies. Instead, we get this.
Well, I have a question completely unrelated to everything you just said, but I appreciate everything
Great.
you just said.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great.
Do you ever do you ever feel the call to like dip back into fiction? Will you ever write a screenplay? Will you write an HBO miniseries? Or is that just not
No,
on the list?
because here's the thing, is the thing I glossed over, is that when I was, in my late teens, early 20s, I really wanted to be a filmmaker, and I remain a serious cinephile. I'm the person who, I haven't owned a TV in 20 years. And if I see a movie, one of the advantages of being a New Yorker is I can go see lots of movies, including old classic movies, at the various art houses around the city on the big screen, as God intended, you know. And at one point, when I was sort of thinking about becoming a filmmaker, I had a friend say, if you become a filmmaker, if you become like a writer director, you're going to spend most of your life just begging people for money. And I remember that striking me in such a way of like, oh, yeah, that's true. So I took a vow, in order to keep myself from falling into that trap. I took a vow to never write a screenplay. I did not take a vow never to write a play. So I wrote a few plays when I was younger, so I could still maybe write a play, but I absolutely took a vow to never write a screenplay. In terms of fiction, I have a big document that is sort of just a novel, in the sense of there's a lot of prose in it, but it's very disjointed. It's the thing, whenever I have the urge to write fiction, I open it up and write a page or two, and then I close it again. And who knows if it'll come into something or not. But yeah, all those urges are still there, but I've sort of figured out ways to do them so I don't. The last time I tried to sit down and go, I'm going to write a novel this summer, I got about a month in and 10,000 words, and then I just like completely lost steam and felt bad. I felt like I failed. Oh my God, you set aside, this summer to do this. You got 10,000 words in, and you're just like, no. It wasn't even some highfalutin literary thing. It was a genre novel, that I was just going to write for fun. And so I'm not putting that kind of pressure on myself anymore. Now I just see what happens when I sit down to write. And again, usually it's another poem, but sometimes it's not. And it's possible that some fiction will somehow bubble up. But yeah, no. And the tragic thing about taking a vow to never write a screenplay is I have a couple of screenplay ideas that are aces, that are absolute, that would just be like amazing elevator pitches. But I'm not going to write them. Just keep them low. What I might do is I just might write here's one of the ideas I've had over the years is I'm going to write a whole piece about an imaginary director and the films that they made, and then all these ideas I've had, I can just pretend there were films that were made by this imaginary director. I may still do that. That would be a fun way to sort of exercise some of those things.
You could really go for it, and you might end up with like a whole biography on a director that includes
Yeah.
all of his full-length screenplays inside of it.
Right. That's a way, that's the classic, when I was a journalist, you'd go sometimes have an assignment and it just didn't, whatever you're supposed to write about just didn't happen. You just couldn't get the story. So then you just have to write the story about how I couldn't get the story. And I think that's the equivalent of, I'm not going to write a screenplay, but I'm going to write about this imaginary movie that, I might have made in some alternate reality. So.
I've been writing a lot of poems lately about how I can't write any poems, and they're not, I don't think I can ever publish them, But it's like I don't know what else to do. I've been very stressed and busy, and so all of my poems are like, all I think about is money. Writing is terrible.
Yeah. I
I
mean, you
guess
could
maybe
just put them together
something.
into a sequence, right? You could just be like, here's the sequence of, here's the stress sequence of poems about, oh, I can't write.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. I have enjoyed talking to you so much. My heart is so full.
Me
You're so
too.
smart. Can I
Thank you.
ask one more question? Can I just, you
Of
sort of
course.
already answered this, but maybe there's something else. Or maybe you just want to, maybe we'll talk about the same thing. But what is one thing, big or small, that you're like excited about? Like a movie this weekend or a huge, amazing thing coming up? What is something you're like kind of giddy for?
My wife and I bought an apartment that we moved into a little over 3 months ago. Um, so every day I'm excited that I'm not giving money to landlords. But I think the thing I'm most excited about is to spend my first summer here in our apartment reading a bunch of books that I've been thinking about reading and just haven't read yet. My to be read pile is like it's it's like a tower, several towers. It's an entire planet. So I'm excited to have some free time to maybe do some rereads. Dennis Johnson's novel Tree of Smoke, which won the National Book Award. I read it when it came out in 2007, but 2007 was one of the worst years of my life, and I remember nothing about it. And I thought, I'm going to reread that because I don't remember anything about this novel except that I enjoyed it. So I'm looking forward to doing things like that. Yeah, I'm just looking forward to having some time read uh, uh, read some more poetry, finish Anne Carson's Wrong Norma, which is an amazing book so far. Finish Joyle McSweeney's Death Styles, which is I highly recommend, an amazing book. It's on Nightboat Books. I've been really getting into Alice Notley's work. I never really read deeply into Alice Notley until recently. There was an amazing sort of interview with her in the Paris Review.
I loved that interview, and I also went, well, I haven't, I need to read her because this interview was brilliant.
Poet's House here in New York City, which is a free poetry library. It has a beautiful space down by Battery Park City, right on the Hudson. They did a wonderful event where they had a reading of people whose books came out during the pandemic, who didn't get a chance to do all the classic book launches and parties and whatnot. And so I was part of that, read, and some of my friends read for it, and other people. And it was a really nice event. But I was sitting there in the room, and they have an entire room at Poet's House. It's like, here's all the books that came out. It's a lot of books. There are a lot of poets out in the world who are not only just writing, but are getting their work through various presses, large and small, out into the world, more than you could ever possibly read. So yeah, there's always lots of poets everywhere to read and discover. And
And I only hope that we get more poets. I think
sure,
everybody should write more and publish something.
hmm
Um,
yeah,
and everybody should have a
or
podcast.
yeah, everybody in the future. Everyone will have a podcast for 15 minutes.
I think we all should. And now I know that when I need someone to fill in for me,
hmm
obviously after this gets very famous and huge and it's just too much work for
Of
me
course,
to handle, you can
yes,
come in and you can guest host for
happy
me.
to do so. Happy to do so.